The night was cold. It was the last day of February 1986, a Friday. Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was walking home from a cinema in Stockholm. His wife, Lisbeth, was with him. They had no bodyguards. Palme had sent them home earlier in the day. He liked to live like a normal person. That was his way. They walked down Sveavägen, one of the city's main streets. It was late, just past 11. The street wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. Cars passed. A few people were walking around. As they neared a corner, near a paint store called Dekorima, a man appeared behind them. He was tall. He wore a dark coat. 2 shots rang out. The sound was sharp and loud in the cold air. One bullet hit Palme in the back. It severed his spinal cord. He fell to the pavement, dying instantly. The second bullet grazed Lisbeth's back. The man stood there for a second. He looked at the couple on the ground. Then he turned and ran. He ran up a small street called Tunnelgatan. He disappeared into the darkness up a flight of steps. In the chaos that followed, witnesses struggled to piece together what they saw. A man running. That was the one consistent detail. A man running away from the scene of the crime. He became a ghost, a phantom haunting Sweden for decades. He was called the Running Man. He was the most wanted witness, or the most wanted killer, in the country's history. And for 34 years, nobody knew who he was. The initial hours and days were a mess. The Swedish police were not prepared for this. A prime minister assassinated on a public street was unthinkable. The crime scene was not properly secured, people walked through it, evidence was lost. The initial alert went out late. The killer had a head start. But the police had witness statements, many of them. And many of them mentioned a man running. A taxi driver saw a man run up the steps at the end of Tunnelgatan. A young woman saw a man in a dark coat moving quickly away from the area. Another witness described a man who looked agitated, who ran from the scene with a limp. The descriptions were similar, but not identical. Some said he wore a hat, others said a cap. Some said he was tall and thin, others described him as more heavyset. From these fractured memories, the police tried to build a picture. They created a composite sketch, the Phantom Building. It became one of the most famous images in Sweden. It showed a man with a determined, almost grim look on his face. He had thin lips and piercing eyes. He wore a dark hat or cap. This face was plastered everywhere, in newspapers, on television, in post offices. This was the Running Man. The police were sure this was their killer. The investigation became the largest in Swedish history. Thousands of people were interviewed. The police chased down every lead, no matter how small or strange. They looked into right-wing extremist groups who hated Palme's socialist policy. They looked into foreign intelligence agencies. Was it the CIA, the KGB? Was it connected to Palme's criticism of South Africa's apartheid regime? An early suspect was a man known as the 33-year-old Victor Gunnarsson. He was a political extremist with connections to anti-Palme groups. He fit the general description. Witnesses tentatively picked him out of a lineup. The police arrested him. The media went into a frenzy. They thought they had their man. But the evidence was thin. Lisbeth Palme could not identify him. After a few weeks, he was released. He later moved to the United States, where he was murdered years later in an unrelated incident. He was a dead end. The police then focused heavily on the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The theory was that they had killed Palme in retaliation for the Swedish government labeling them a terrorist organization. The lead police investigator, Hans Holmer, became obsessed with this theory. He orchestrated massive raids on Kurdish communities in Stockholm. He arrested dozens of people. It was a huge operation, but it produced nothing. No weapon, no confession, no concrete link to the assassination. The PKK track was another dead end, and it cost Holmer his job. It was a national embarrassment. Years passed. The case file grew to a staggering size. It filled hundreds of meters of shelf space. It was a graveyard of theories, rumors, and false leads. The Running Man remained a ghost. Then came Christer Pettersson. Pettersson was a local criminal. He was an alcoholic and a drug addict. He had a long history of violent crime, including a manslaughter conviction. He lived near the crime scene. And he looked, to some, a bit like the man in the Phantom sketch. The police brought him in. Lisbeth Palme, who had been standing right next to her husband when he was shot, was asked to view a video lineup. She picked out Pettersson. She said she was certain it was him. Her testimony was powerful. It was the word of the victim's wife, based largely on her identification. Christer Pettersson was put on trial. The prosecution argued he had killed Palme in a random, impulsive act of violence. There was no clear motive other than Pettersson being a dangerous and unstable man. Pettersson denied everything. He had an alibi, but it was weak. The district court found him guilty. Christer Pettersson was sentenced to life in prison. It seemed the mystery was finally solved. The running man had a name and a face. Sweden could finally move on. But it wasn't that simple. Pettersson's lawyer appealed the verdict, and when the case went to the appeals court, the conviction was overturned. The court found Lisbeth Palme's identification to be unreliable. The police had given her hints beforehand that the man they suspected was an alcoholic. Pettersson was the only person in the lineup who looked like one. The court decided her memory might have been influenced. Beyond her testimony, there was no technical evidence, no weapon, no fingerprints. DNA tied Christer Pettersson to the crime. He was released from prison, became a strange kind of celebrity. He would go on TV and talk about the case, sometimes hinting he did it, other times fiercely denying it. He made money from his infamy. For many Swedes, he was the killer who got away. For others, he was a scapegoat, a convenient suspect in a case the police were desperate to close. Pettersson died in 2004 from a head injury. He never confessed. The case was wide open again. The ghost was back. The running man was still out there. The years turned into decades. The Palme investigation continued, but with less intensity. A new generation of investigators took over. They went back through the massive files looking for something that had been missed. The cost of the investigation ballooned to hundreds of millions of kroner. It became a national obsession, a wound that would not heal. And all this time, there was another man. A man who was there that night. A man who had spoken to the police just hours after the murder. He was a witness. His name was Stig Engström. Engström was a graphic designer. He worked for a company called Skandia, in a large office building right next to the crime scene. He was known as the Skandia Man. On the night of the murder, Engström had been working late. He clocked out of his office at 11:19 p.m., just a few minutes before the assassination. He told police he was one of the first people on the scene. He said he saw Palme on the ground. He said he spoke to Lisbeth Palme. He even claimed he tried to help with resuscitation. He gave detailed descriptions of what he saw and did. He even pointed out a running man, saying he thought it was a young person. The police interviewed him several times in the early days. They saw him as a witness. A somewhat unreliable one, perhaps. His story kept changing. He was eager to talk to the media. He seemed to enjoy the attention. He even made a reenactment for a Swedish television channel showing his supposed actions at the crime scene. He criticized the police investigation, saying they weren't listening to him properly. The police saw him as a nuisance, an attention seeker. They classified him as a person of no interest and moved on. They were hunting for the running man, the phantom from the sketch. Stig Engström, the talkative witness, didn't fit their profile of a cold-blooded killer. He was just a guy who happened to be there. And so for more than 30 years, Stig Engström was hiding in plain sight. He was in the case files, but he was filed under witness, not suspect. A few independent researchers and journalists began to look at Engström more closely. They noticed the inconsistencies in his story. Other witnesses at the crime scene did not remember him being there. They didn't remember anyone trying to resuscitate Palme in the way he described. His claims didn't add up. They also looked at his movements that night. He left his office just before the murder. He walked in the same direction as the killer fled. He wore a dark coat and a cap, similar to some witness descriptions. He had firearms training. He was a member of a shooting club. He owned a weapon of the same caliber as the murder weapon, although tests could not prove it was the exact gun. He had financial problems. He had a drinking problem. He also had a known dislike for Olof Palme and his politics. Slowly, a new picture began to emerge. What if the Skandia man and the running man were the same person? What if Engström didn't just happen upon the scene? What if he saw Palme walking down the street, followed him, and shot him? What if his witness account was a lie, a performance designed to mislead the police? What if he wasn't running away as a killer, but jogging away as someone pretending to be an innocent bystander, maybe even pretending to chase the real killer? This theory reframed everything. The running man was not a shadowy figure disappearing into the night. He was a middle-aged graphic designer who stuck around, who talked to the police, who inserted himself into the investigation. He wasn't hiding from the spotlight. He was seeking it out. It was a bold, almost insane deception. The man who had pointed out a running man might have been the running man himself. This theory gained traction. The journalist Thomas Pettersson, no relation to Christer, wrote a book laying out the case against Engström in meticulous detail. The police, now under a new chief prosecutor named Christer Peterson, decided to take a final serious look at the Skandia man. They re-interviewed old witnesses. They analyzed Engström's statements again. They looked at his background. The pieces started to fit together. His timeline matched. His clothing matched some descriptions. His personality, that of a frustrated man who wanted to be seen as important, provided a possible psychological motive. He wanted to be a hero, but in his failure he became a killer. There was a problem, though. Stig Engström was dead. He had taken his own life in the year 2000. He could never be questioned again. He could never be put on trial. In June 2020, 34 years after the murder, Chief Prosecutor Christer Peterson held a press conference. The world was watching. He announced that the massive, decades-long investigation was coming to an end. He laid out the case against Stig Engström. He detailed the inconsistencies, the witness statements, the background checks. He concluded that they had enough evidence to believe Engström was the killer. He was the running man. Because the main suspect was dead, the investigation would be closed. There it was. After 3 decades, a name was officially attached to the crime. The ghost had been identified. But the announcement was not met with universal relief. It was an anticlimax. There was no smoking gun. There was no DNA evidence, no weapon, no confession. It was a circumstantial case. It was a conclusion based on a prosecutor's conviction, not a court's verdict. Many people were not convinced. What about the witnesses who described a different man? What about Lisbeth Palme, who identified Christer Peterson with such certainty? Was she wrong? Or was she so traumatized that her memory was flawed? The prosecutor suggested that she might have simply identified the man who looked most like a criminal in the lineup, not the man she actually saw that night. The conclusion left many questions unanswered. If Engström was the killer, how did he, an amateur, pull off a perfect murder and get away with it? Why did he stick around the scene? Was it just arrogance? Was he truly alone? Or was he part of a wider conspiracy? The identity of the running man has, in a way, been solved. The official answer is Stig Engström. He was the man in the dark coat who was at the scene and who moved away from it. But the term running man was always more than just a description of a person's movement. It was a symbol of the mystery itself. For decades, Swedes imagined a professional assassin, a cold and calculating figure who vanished without a trace. The reality, if the final conclusion is to be believed, is far more mundane and perhaps more disturbing. The killer was not a super spy or a hardened political extremist. He was a graphic designer from down the hall. A frustrated, attention-seeking man who committed a crime and then tried to talk his way out of it by playing the part of a key witness. The running man was never a single clear figure. He was a composite of different witness memories, colored by fear and confusion. One witness saw a man running up the stairs. Another saw a man limping away. Another saw a man in a different kind of hat. It's possible people saw different men running that night. In the panic after a gunshot, many people might have run. The police, in their desperation, fused these images into one, the Phantombilden, the ultimate suspect. They hunted this phantom for years. They tried to fit Christer Peterson into that role, and it didn't quite work. They looked for him among Kurdish rebels and South African spies, but the real killer may have been the one who didn't fit the profile. The one who didn't run far, the one who stopped, came back, and started talking. So, who was the running man? The answer is complicated. On paper, it's Stig Engström. The investigation is closed, but in the collective memory of Sweden, the running man remains a ghost. He represents the uncertainty, the lost evidence, the botched investigation, and the decades of unanswered questions. He is the figure running up Tunnel Gatan, forever disappearing into the dark, just out of reach of definitive proof. The case is closed, but for many, the story doesn't feel finished. The running never really stopped.